Okay, Pratish, we are good to go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the lecture at SEDA Navrachna University. My name is Pratyush Shankar, and I'm the Dean of School of Environmental Design and Architecture, that is Navrachna University at Baroda in India. And today is a very special moment and a very special lecture. And today we have a very prominent professor, internationally acclaimed professor, and also a very good friend, a very dear friend, uh, Dr. Julia Hegewart. And it's really a proud moment for us and really a special moment, as I said, that we could convince her to come and deliver a lecture here on a subject that we are all very passionate about, and that is on water architecture. This is a subject that not only us, but Professor Julia has spent decades thinking about and writing about. I have had the honor and an opportunity to be with Professor Julia, to work with her as an Humboldt Fellow in her department. She comes from the University of Bonn. She has worked extensively in many countries. She was teaching in the UK, and then for many years she has been in this lovely town of Bonn and in a very beautiful university of the University of Bonn. And before I ask her, because you all would be waiting for Professor Julia to come over, before I ask her to come over and take the stage, I would just like to introduce Professor Julia for everyone's advantage. So Professor Julia Hegewald is a professor of Oriental Art History and head of Department of Asian and Islamic Art History at the University of Bonn. She was a reader in art history in Manchester, a postdoctoral fellow at South Asian Institute in Heidelberg, Germany, and a research fellow at the University College, Oxford. She holds a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, commonly known as SOAS, in London, one of the most important places for Asian and Oriental studies. She's a specialist in South Asian history of art and architecture, with special focus on water architecture, Jain temple building, reuse theory, and city planning. Her books include Water Architecture in South Asia, a study of type, development, and meanings, Jain temple architecture in India, the development of distinct language in space and ritual, the Jain heritage, distinction, decline, and resilience. Then another one, In the Shadow of Golden Age, Art and Identity from Gandhara to the Modern Age, that came out in 2014. And in 2015, another publication, Jain Painting and Manuscript Culture, in memory of Paulo Pinarsava. That's in 2015. In 2020, she came up with In Footsteps of the Masters, Footprints, Feet, and Shoes as objects of veneration in Asian, Islamic, and Mediterranean art. And together with Subrata K. Mitra, she wrote Reuse, The Art and Politics of Anxiety and Integration. That was in 2012. So I'm really happy, Professor Julia, that you are here. Thanks for agreeing and kindly come and now deliver your lecture.
Pratyush, thank you very much for these very kind words of introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today. Special thanks also go to Professor Nile, of course, for being here and for the entire setup. I'll actually share.
You went on mute.
I went on mute.
No, now you're back. You're back.
I'm back. Okay, it just went up and down. So oops, what is this? We are somehow on Blackboard. Hold on. So,
yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, and you can see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can, Julia.
Yes. Perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you again for these wonderful words of introduction. I joined the Navrachna University Center for Heritage Research this summer, and I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this fascinating conglomerate of researchers from India, from the US, and from Germany. And we had a very good meeting already, and I'm looking forward to cooperating in the future. By training, I'm actually an art historian, but with specialization on the history of architecture in South Asia. And as Pratyush said, I've now been based at the University of Bonn in Germany for the past 10 years. And as Pratyush mentioned also, today I've been asked to speak about water architecture in South Asia, a topic which I started to be interested in long ago, actually in about 1994. I started researching, I did my PhD dissertation on this subject at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And it was also, trying to go on, get exactly the topic of my first monograph published by Brill in 2002. Which came out, but it has been a topic which still occupies me very much, on which I still collect new material, I continue to publish, and on which I hope to learn more. I mean, Gujarat, where you mainly are based, is of course a region which is so well known for its magnificent water architecture. Okay, without wasting any more time, I would like to start my paper presentation. I'm aware that there is quite a diverse audience here. Many of you are architects from India. Sometimes it might be, I try not to be too introductory, but to mention issues and concepts which are important for the understanding. Now, the collection, storage, and distribution of water managed by means of dams, reservoirs, and tanks, or also wells, are activities which are central to life and religious ritual in South Asia. As in most cultures, also, for instance, in Germany, but also in South Asia, water is regarded as sacred. I think this is really in all cultures the case, and especially sacred are usually the rivers. It's interesting that whilst in South Asia, the rivers are more likely to be treated as female entities, Ganga, Yamuna, Godavari. In Germany, often there are more fatherly. The Rhine River at which one is located is called Father Rhine because it's a big river. So there are differences, but there are a lot of commonalities as well. And it's very interesting to look at this. Now, because of this association of the sacredness of water and particularly of rivers, we frequently find temples and religious images either next to or within rivers and lakes, as here, for instance, at Pashimavahini near Srirangapatnam in Karnataka. It's not just, I mean, sometimes it can even just be a simple painted stone. Here we actually have, I'm using the cursor, I think you can see it, an image placed on a stone on a little island in the river, which is now flooded. But we can also find temple buildings next to rivers or lakes, and often also commemorative structures. Because water dissolves all forms and leads to new life, to a rebirth, it also plays an important role in funerary rituals. Cremations, of course, are undertaken along rivers. And then we have often commemorative structures, as here the chhatris, the 14 chhatris of the rulers of Ocha, for instance, here at Ocha from the 16th to 17th century at the Betwa River, as commemorative structures. And also in Islam, of course, water and water gardens are closely connected with the concept of paradise. Water is also a fertilizing and nourishing element. It, of course, waters the fields, flowing through the landscape, the rivers, water plants and fields. And therefore, rivers have traditionally been associated with motherhood and with sacred cows in South Asia. Cows, of course, as very powerful maternal images. And they've also been associated with milk. This is interestingly a connection which is also made in the Rig Veda. Sorry, got a very dry throat. It'll get better. In water architecture, we therefore frequently find water spouts, as you can see in the left image, in the shape of cow heads. Here, the sacredness of this spout, this Gomuk spout, has been marked again by the red color and the offerings made on top. This is the so-called Unapdev hot spring at Adavad in Maharashtra. But these are very common throughout South Asia, also in Nepal, for instance. Especially venerated, of course, is the river Ganges, and personified anthropomorphic images of the river goddess, as you can see her on the right, are common throughout South Asia. This statue on the right of Ganga Devi is from the Mulchok part of the royal palace at Patan in the Kathmandu Valley. It's a 17th century bronze, and we see Ganga Devi as personified goddess standing on a makara. However, we do not only find the veneration of images, water itself, of course, that of the Ganges or any basin or well is regarded as a divine and sacred substance. And this is why venerations or meditations are also conducted towards the waters, as here as the Kushava Tirtha at Trimbak. It is the spiritual source of the Godavari River, and the architectural arrangement around it are dating largely from the 18th century. A similar idea of the direct veneration of the waters is also found behind the Arati ritual performed in the evenings at sacred rivers and lakes. So it's not the waving in front of an image with a flame, but letting flames float here on the Ganges at Harikipari Ghat at Hardwar. Now, we have paid quite a lot of attention to the significance of water in Hindu religious ritual, but Muslims too, of course, must be ritually clean before praying or entering a mosque. And this led, for instance, to the development of complex hot baths, as we can see here on the left, a hammam, the Bachai Hammam in Golconda, dating from the 16th, 17th century, had cold and warm water basins of different shapes. Lotus shapes are very recurrent, and also platforms for massage. And also most Sikh gurdwaras, as we can see here on the right, are connected with substantial water tanks, bathing tanks and reservoirs. Many have a number of them. This is here the major bathing tank of the Sikh Gurdwara in Gwalior Fort, just to show you one example. Although Buddhist and Jainas seem at a first glance more critical or opposed to ritual purification through water and bathing, this is at least what Buddhist or Jain texts tell us. But this is a theory. But if we look at the practice, also their temples regularly have bathing tanks or are located at rivers and lakes or tanks. And I'll show you examples from these religious backgrounds in a moment. My argument is that it is a unifying topic, one which has to do with climate, but also with a cultural approach, and not so much with specific views or doctrine of separate religions. So a kind of a South Asian phenomenon where one religion affected the other, and where architectural approaches are shared and developed together. Despite the practical and religious importance of water, some religious water sites have not been artificially edged or architecturally designed. And it's particularly interesting also to examine those where we don't find the architecture when the architecture is so common. For instance, at the source of the Ganges, up on the top photograph at Gomuk, up in the Himalayas, and at another important site further down the Ganges, for instance, here at Allahabad, this photo was taken during the Magh Mela, no steps or buildings have been constructed. On a religious point or level, one might argue that at these places, the element water or the divine river are still venerated in their natural and unbound shape. However, also more practical reasons, I'm absolutely convinced, would have played a role, such as the difficulty to tame fast-flowing waters. I mean, the Ganges issues below a glacier. It's quite large already here at the source at Allahabad, where allegedly 3, but definitely 2 physical rivers, visible rivers, Ganga and Yamuna, create a confluence, flow into one another. We have constantly changing riverbeds where this will have been difficult. But also in Benares, some of the most ritually important Ghats are not actually bound in steps yet. So there seems to be an issue. There are practical issues, but also, I think, metaphysical or religious reasons. So such natural sites, however, are rather rare, and most rivers and lakes were bound and developed architecturally and are adorned with steps, temples, and pavilions. A good example is the Gadisar Lake at Jaisalmer in Rajasthan, developed in 1367 with a variety of features, and you can see the mirror images being so important here. Now, in my comprehensive study of water architecture in South Asia, I divided, in order to be able to handle the material better, to be able to study the material better, I classified the material into 5 main types. These types were derived from visual aspects and partially from textual traditions also, but there is, of course, not only one way of classifying it, but the one I'm introducing to you, I found very helpful for my work. And of course, there are always hybrids and border types which combine different typologies. Now, I would like to introduce these types very briefly. The first group shown in these 2 images here are the Ghats. Ghats are flights of steps permitting access to water. I would argue that they are at least typical, if not unique, of South Asia. It's a tradition which, for instance, we don't find in Europe or in the Western world. I'm not sure how far east we can find them, but in India, in South Asia, they are extremely well developed. Their main function is to secure the embankment, to permit safe and easy access to the water at often considerably changing levels. And this is something which we'll, in a few later examples, also be able to see very well, the enormous adaptability of these water structures, the incredible engineering achievements, even if at first glance they sometimes can look quite simple. Because in South Asia, of course, due to the changing water levels, the monsoon rains and the dry or the snow melting after the winter, it causes, of course, extreme changes in water level, up to 10-15 meters in difference. Now, on the left slide, you can see the Ghat steps in Pashupatinath in Nepal, the main cremation site. Interesting here in Pashupatinath is that we find these Ghat steps on both sides of the river, which is reasonably unusual. For instance, in Benares, we only find one embankment clad in stone. The connection with temples, with cremation platforms and other features is very interesting to study for an architect. Or here at Jaisalmer Lake in Rajasthan, the dammed river Gomati, which Maharaja Jai Singh in 1685 developed after a very severe drought, is a beautiful example of creating bays within longer stretches of Ghat steps and integrating platforms into them. Now, these Ghat steps, of course, also show up in other types. For instance, type 2, according to my classification, are tanks. These can be large, but they are usually not very deep because they largely collect rainwater, or can also be fed by springs and rivers, but their main the main technique of creating or collecting water is rainwater, and therefore the surface normally is tried to be very large. Here again, a Sikh example from Taran in the Punjab. And you can see how the architects play with mirror images, counterbalancing a very flat horizontal sheet of water with a tall tower element. I think there's a lot of visual imagery, visual playfulness here. Other tanks are smaller, and it's interesting that sometimes the tank can almost replace the architecture of the temple. Here, this image of sleeping Vishnu or Vishnu Narayana at Budanikanta in the north of Kathmandu, dating from 641, is the largest of 3 images of this type placed in water. And here the image is not placed in a building, in an edifice, but in a water tank, and there is no temple next to it anymore. The image in the tank here is the sacred site, which I think is a very interesting aspect, because in contrast with temple architecture, of course, water architecture had been much more neglected in art historical studies, because they were often regarded as engineering products, as something not art historical, which of course all these examples show you that there is no reason to classify them as less important. In many respects, I think they are maybe more important, or definitely on the same level. Now, in addition to these flat tanks which collect rainwater, we have another type of reservoir, which I again would argue is typical or unique to South Asia. And I call this deep reservoir a kunda. I know that kunda, the term, is used more neutrally also. It also means a sacred water site. There are ghats, and there are tanks, and there are wells sometimes, which are called in their name something like kunda. But of course, we know that we also have water structures which are called sagar or samudra. And of course, we all know that the well, which is called samudra, is not a sea or an ocean, but that it's a religious image which is transferred here, kind of. So not every structure that it's called a kunda in its name falls into this architectural category. I could not come up with a better category or name for it. Most of the structures which fall into this deep funnel-shaped reservoir type with a well in the middle are called kundas, and also some of the text make us kind of follow this line. So what I mean by a kunda is a stepped water basin which penetrates deep into the ground and taps almost in all cases groundwater or shallow aquifers. The Nepalese kundas are built on the slopes of the Himalayas, and they can also tap sideways running aquifers, shallow aquifers. But in South Asia, it's practically always a well shaft in the bottom. I'm telling you in a moment where these structures are found. Of course, at higher water level, it's very difficult to say if there's actually a well shaft in the middle. But to me, what is important is what the architects wanted it to look. In most cases, there is a well shaft in the middle at drier water level. But there are a few examples, such as this down below here. This is the so-called ritual bath at Vijayanagara, dating from, the site is 14th to 17th century. But it's really fascinating. It's first confusing because it obviously has a flat floor in the middle. But every stone has a number and a letter in Kannada written on it. And it has been argued quite convincingly that this water structure is actually a looted object, which was taken probably from a sacred water site and assembled at the capital of Vijayanagara as a kind of trophy, or at least a beautiful object, you know, if it was not removed against people's wishes, you know, it's not its original context. It is fed by an above the ground kind of water channel, an aqueduct, whilst the other structures here on the left, this is the Kunda at Ganerao in Rajasthan, and the one above is the Brahma Kunda at Shihor in Gujarat from the early 12th century. It's one of the earliest Kunda examples with these beautiful niches and masses of images surrounding it. So in section, my type of Kunda, my classification has a kind of funnel resembling, or it resembles kind of a funnel with a very small water area, or comparatively small water area at the bottom, with little evaporation, much less evaporation than the tanks have. And it's also typical to find these pyramidal step formations often, there's a lot of variety, but these pyramidal steps buttress the ground. They kind of stabilize this very steeply sloping construction. So inside a kunda, we usually have a well. Sometimes the well can also be on the outside of the kunda, but feeding it, but we have a well. And the fourth type, which according to my classification are actual wells. But wells, as you all know, are a huge group again by themselves. It can be very simple draw wells, but I've chosen this particularly, it's a well, the Dharma Kupa from Benares, but we find this all over India, that even simple wells, where one could argue that they are mainly technical water provision, you know, even they are often placed under sacred trees, surrounded by shrines, with walls around. The sacred nature is even expressed by these simplest of, smallest of water structures, really. Much more obvious are the ritual and religious connotations, of course, when it comes to large stepwells, which are so very well studied in Gujarat. Here, the Rani, a photograph of the Rani Vav, of course, one of the best known stepwells today from the 11th century at Patan. Which of course has about 500 sacred structures and shrines in the well shaft. In addition to draw wells and step wells, we also have the category of so-called spiral wells. Sometimes they are also called kupagars, where the steps are not in a straight corridor as we have in the step wells, but where the steps kind of circle around the well shaft, which is a more central arrangement, but again combined with apartments and additional parts. Now, a more eclectic group is type 5, which is the last type in my study, which overall might be called ornamental pools. And these include small ornamental pools or fountain basins. On the left, I'm showing you a Mughal fountain basin from the 17th century from the Rang Mahal in the Lal Killa in Delhi. This group also contains baths, the hammams, but also water gardens. And this is probably one of the earliest preserved formalized water gardens in Sri Lanka, in Sigiriya, dating from the 5th, 6th century of the Common Era, and showing that a formalized tradition of water gardens existed in South Asia before the arrival of Islam, although it of course was not so widespread and developed, and it got revived and further developed particularly with the Mughal conquest of Kashmir. Now, pools were combined with a whole range of accessories, such as fountains, cascades, and water chutes, which are not usually found in water architecture outside a private or royal context. So this last group is more eclectic, and it's more found within a kind of private or royal context, where the same types as we have did before were often further developed. They were larger, they were more precious, they were more heavily decorated, and we find certain accessories or additional types which are new. So according to my view, water structures are amongst the most visually impressive buildings of the region of South Asia, and they always have practical and metaphysical importance. Just two more examples: the Abaneri Kunda, which you all know in Gujarat, at the bottom level dating from the 8th century, and the top parts having been rebuilt substantially by Mughals in the 16th, 17th century, or the Adlar Jwar from the 15th century here in Ahmedabad. Extraordinary structures, underground negative architecture, heavily decorated, strong religious connotations, but also an adaptability to these enormous changes in water level. Now, there are certain themes which run through and interconnect the different types of water architecture. I mean, at the moment, one could believe, well, we have these clearly delineated types which are not connected, but that would be really boring. I mean, the interesting thing is all these connecting strands which run through these buildings. And today I would like to introduce you very briefly just to two of these connecting themes, which I find very interesting. The first theme is the development from platforms to islands. Might sound abstract in the moment, but I'll take you through the development. Steps along rivers, the Ghats usually have platforms. This is here the Jalabinayak temple in Choba, the place where Manjushri allegedly cut the Choba Gorge and drained the Kathmandu Valley to make it habitable. And we have here pronounced platforms demarcating the edges of, the Ghat of course continued here in the past, but now it's a short section which is kept. Protection of the sides, the ends of the Ghat, and the delineation of the structure of the Ghats. We can have bays created here. Now, these platforms, as you can see on the left, can be used for a variety of functions: to rest, to work, to sell produce, to fish. Priests use them for their offering their services here, for instance, in Benares at Raj Ghat, but also for cremation rituals, but these usually have a different shape. Many platforms along are elongated at the back. We have the platform, which is normally octagonal, bastion-like, and then very often we have these walls continuing behind the platform towards the embankment. They're quite massive walls, and they create protective bays. They kind of cut into the steps. Here again, images from Brijrana Ghat, Benares, mainly 17th to 19th century. And here, for instance, the Baradari Ghat at Bittur in Uttar Pradesh. I hope that the examples also show you the enormous widespread nature of these structures. They are not confined to Gujarat or the north of India. I'm really trying to show you examples from all regions of the subcontinent. Now, this creation of bays in connection with platforms and walls or building elements connected to them can also happen on several levels, on 3 levels here, for instance, as we can see at Pushkar Lake. Now, at low water level, we can wander around them and walk in and out. It's quite public approach then. At higher water level, we have almost a creation of courtyard areas here, which are more private, which are not accessible then to everybody. Now, when found at the down at the water's edge, these bridging elements reach out into the water. Again, they are adaptable. The wall can appear or it can grow into the water at the front. And these, at first, solid looking structures can, of course, be broken up by integrating niches or entire temples. And the fact that they are, for certain times of the year, flooded is, of course, perceived as auspicious, as positive, and the images are cleaned off the mud of the river after they reappear and perceived as particularly potent. Here examples again from Benares, Rana Mangat on the left, and Mathura Bengali Ghat. Now, the bridging elements, which start off quite short, get longer and longer in the development of these structures. They protrude further into the water, and they become more fragile often. So when we look down here at this development at Keshigarh, in Vrindavan, at the front of the princely houses of Bharatpur, Jaipur, and Gwalior in the 16th, 17th century, you can see that these massive walls have become skeletal, very decorative, much more fragile, and also that we have a two-storied approach. We have a shrine in the bottom and then often a shrine built on top, and it's not quite a mirror image, but it almost plays with images of mirroring and multiplication, which I find really fascinating. The top image is again from Bengali Ghat in Mathura. Now, this is the development along rivers, where, of course, the river water is running, it's flowing, there's a certain pull, and you can't extend forever into the river. It depends, of course, on the depths and the strengths of the river. But in the Ganges, for instance, with its very powerful running water, particularly after the rains or after the snow has melted, you cannot extend further than 6 to 7 meters into the river, or it will be, these structures will be broken off. Now, when we come to the environment of tank architecture, where the water is still, of course, these bridges or platforms and bridges could develop much further and become more fragile. So the examples in tank architecture can extend by 10 to 20 meters into the water. And we often have multiple examples. On the left, we see an image from Kusumban Sarovar. This is at Radhakund near Bharatpur, the 17th, 18th century, beautifully decorated bridging elements, or here on the right, which you probably know, in the Gopal Saga at Deeg in Rajasthan, 18th century, Jat rulers, very fragile, completely hollowed out. It's almost like a pavilion architecture, again double-storied at high water level. The upper level is accessible. At lower water level, we have these shaded arcades, and almost the bastion has become a pleasure pavilion, really, very fragile, but beautiful and multifunctional. This then, I would argue, led to the development or from platforms with short bridging elements to the development of long bridges leading to proper islands carrying frequently large building structures. And this can be temple buildings. This is a Jain example. The Jala Mandir, the water temple at Pavapuri in Bihar, the enlightenment and cremation site of Mahavira, the 24th Jinnah, or a tomb. The example on the top is Sher Sur's tomb at Sasaram from the mid-16th century. An example of a palace in this environment would be the Farabaksh Palace at Ahmednagar in Maharashtra. So all faith groups are connected with this architecture. Of course, very well known, the Golden Temple of the Sikhs in Amritsar falls into the same category. And also the name, of course, the Amrit Sarovar, the pool of immortality, explains in the way the appearance of the nectar, the Adigran, the golden temple in the middle of this water. It's very, very beautiful imagery. So isolated by a sheet of water, these religious structures, temples or tombs, stand out and seem detached from our world, and they appear to rise from the tanks and to be materializations of, if you want to say, the gods or the divine powers believed to be contained within the waters, or the recreational powers or the cleansing powers. And interesting is also this transitional nature of the bridges, which express that one is about to leave one's own ordinary grounds and enter an area which is qualitatively different. It's not like ordinary space on the bank. Now, this development was taken further and further. We have bridges leading to islands which are almost 300 meters long. The longest I'm aware of is the one in the Kankaria tank at Ahmedabad, which is so large that it's very difficult to photograph. So I've shown you here a bridge which is only about 155 meters long in the Nyai Malau, Talau in Dholka, also in Gujarat. Beautiful, you know, how you try to be bigger and bigger and take this seam further and further. But you can, of course, imagine the island or the pavilion is in the middle of the lake, so it's an enormous lake that you need also. You know, it needs to be double the length of the bridge plus the island. So enormous constructions here, you know, which are, of course, partially used to guarantee the water supply of a region, or to make a region or a community independent, but also to show the influence and the might of rulers and of gods and their association with them, you know, but multifaceted. And I've included, although I return to the topic of modernity at the end, also a modern example, a design by Geoffrey Bava, the Sri Lankan architect, inaugurated in 1976, the Sima Malaka temple complex in Colombo, in the Beira Lake, which has one bridge leading to 3 interconnected islands. So he picks up an ancient theme but develops it further in a modern context. Okay, that was the first connecting theme, which I find fascinating because one can, it's not necessarily a consecutive development. I cannot show this is the earliest example, which is simple, and this is the furthest develops, which is late, because water architecture is constantly rebuilt, restored, because the power and the dampness of the water makes a constant recreation and reconstruction necessary, but also keeps the structures alive. But I think the development has still become clear. Now, the second theme, which is slightly shorter, which I would briefly like to touch upon, is the question of reservoirs, artificial reservoirs next to natural larger water bodies, or smaller tanks within larger tanks, or even Ghats in water architecture. Like a Russian doll, these you can play around with the themes endlessly, and it's really fascinating what different versions we can find and for what reasons. So there is a clear tendency to find artificial pools, or this is, I would call a kunda, because it goes quite deeply down, but you can also call it a tank. It's a reservoir next to the eternally flowing Ganges river. This is here so-called Gauri Kunda in Kedar Ghat at Benares. Now, according to the Kashi Kanda, to the legendary history of Benares, Gauri Kunda, which you can see here, this small reservoir, is the first water pool ever created on Earth. It was allegedly carved out by Vishnu himself with his disc. A similar kunda actually is found just a little few ghats down the river at Manikarnika Ghat. We have Manikarnika Kunda, which in layout is just slightly larger, but found in the same position on a platform kind of above the river with the steps leading down. And in both, I mean, in Manikarnika Kunda, the story is that in the middle of the day that all tirthas from the whole of India come to cleanse themselves of the pollution which humans have washed off in them. So there are mythological, I mean, they've got very closely attached legends, religious stories, and possibly the explanation is here that whilst the river Ganges is the archetype of all sacred waters, of course, but it is huge and it is eternally running, flowing. And these two kundas, here you have very small, very precise spots chosen by the gods or by the tirthas, where pilgrims can almost step into their footsteps and really partake in mystical history, in the creation of the world, and almost reenact on spot really important religious and mythological deeds. It's maybe more tangible, more defined, more fixed than the river, which is sacred all over. But important is that these small demarcated artificial sites, I would not argue that they diminish, but they contribute to the sacredness. They kind of enhance the site even more. They are not rivals really for the Ganges. And we find very, very many such examples at Ujjain, at Ramgarh, or at Nasik. We have basins next to the Sipra and Godavari rivers, where the Ganges, for instance, is said to surface at times. So you have a different river and the Ganges is meant to come up. And these ideas of these subterranean channels of the Ganges, these Patala Gangas, you know, we find all over India. Sometimes it's only at certain times of the year, at certain festivals, when the river water of the Ganges is meant to bubble up at other sites. Sometimes it's all, you know, it's continuously. Or on the right, again, we have a specific story. This is the tank of the Uttareshwara temple at Bhuvaneshwar in Orissa. The small tank here behind, we have the larger lake at Bhuvaneshwar. And here the local story is that the goddess Godavari was invited by King Lingaraja into the temple, but because she was menstruating at the time, was not allowed to bathe in the sacred Bindusagar lake behind, and the gods created this special basin for her. This is why it's frequented particularly by women. So it's the idea of tanks or of basins of different purity. Water is pure, it's purifying, but there are different levels of purity. And this is really fascinating when examining water sites. I'll show you one more really interesting example which fits into this context in a moment. We also find basins within larger water structures. So at Nasik, the Godavari River has been partitioned by these architecturally not very challenging concrete constructions, but they allow more people access to water. You extend the shore by building bridges, bridging elements into it, and by creating secure bathing areas. So very interesting is also on the right, this example from Pushkar Lake. Pushkar Lake is huge and very flat. And in the dry season, it almost entirely dries off and you can't bathe. But close to the Ghats, very deep kunda-like funnel-shaped reservoirs were dug into the ground with steps. And of course here, the water remains much longer. So it's a way of preserving, of making water accessible also in the dry season when the lake dries out. So sometimes it's more practical, sometimes it's more religious reasons, and usually it's both combined, which makes them so powerful and so interesting. This is the story I wanted to tell you. On the left, this is the source, the basin of the source of the Narmada River at Amarkantak. And here we have three categories of pureness of water. When you arrive at the site, you have water taps outside the wall where you wash your hands, your feet, your face. Then you're allowed to have a full body bath in the tank. And after that, you come to the third sacred, the most sacred water place. And this is this little temple, and the area at the front, exactly the spot where the Narmada is meant to bubble up for the first time. And this is believed to be the purest water. And here you don't bathe in, you simply sprinkle. This is just a ritual purification, which is the last and the deepest and the most important purification. So this staggering, this classifying of waters is really fascinating to observe, because it's so well developed in an Indian context. And there are other examples, as here, for instance, the Mahadeva temple at Taleshwar in Rajasthan, where you have a bridge leading to the center of a lake with a platform, and inside the platform is again a hole, a pool, so you can bathe in the center of the lake without swimming out and back, but by walking, you know, by architecturally framing it, kind of. Okay, the largest number of compartments created within a larger water body, which I'm aware of, are the dozen or so compartments in the Sipra River in front of the Kalyade Mahal at Ujjain in Madhya Pradesh, a site started in the 15th century and enlarged by Akbar in the 17th century, which shows platforms and islands, pavilions, pools in between. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a really creative site. So related to this idea of smaller pools next to and within larger bodies is then, in a last step, also the integration of Ghat steps into, not just along, but into water, as you can see here at Pandharpur on the left. You have a kind of a Ghat block, a pyramid of steps constructed inside the river, because at Pandharpur in Maharashtra, the river, the bed of the river is so shallow that it recedes very far from the edge. The Ghats are not reached by water in the dry season, and then people travel by boat to Ghats inside the river, where there's always river water available, and it can be used in the same way. Now, a really interesting case where, however, it adapts to the opposite. Here on the left side, dryness, a lack of water is the problem, but also, you know, high water levels create opportunities. And this orange, again, from an architectural point of view, not particularly challenging temple at a first glance. It's the Sri Motilal Vora temple at Sindhya Ghat in Benares. At dry water level, it's just a temple. But when the Ganges, the water level rises, you can imagine it goes up to here. And then the roof of the temple sticks out of the water, and you can see the structure of the roof. It's a floating Ghat. It just looks like this because it becomes detached from the embankment. And although normally one would not walk on the roof of a temple or above a divinity, here it is permitted. And I can show you photographs where this is used just like a floating Ghat, a Ghat in the middle of the river. So enormous diversity in use and adaptability to enormous changing water levels. Absolutely fascinating. So the architecture along rivers and tanks in South Asia is designed to adapt to extreme changes in water level between the seasons, and succeeds in fulfilling different functions at different times of the year. To conclude, but I'm also having a prologue on modern examples, but we are almost at the end now. In water architecture, there are certain themes, such as the development from platforms to bridges and islands, and of basins next to and within larger water bodies, or twin and multiple pools, as we have seen. These themes are found in connection with all types and all regions, all periods and all contexts, both religious, urban, defensive, technical, all contexts, profane and religious. And the themes seem unique to and typical of South Asian culture as a whole, rather than only unique to a certain religion within it, or a religious situation in general, or to a period, or to a a region, geographic region. They're really found throughout and all over. I hope that even the few slides which I could show you today have illustrated that South Asian water structures are highly sophisticated forms of construction. They are amongst the most visually impressive buildings of the region, and they signify both practical and metaphysical importance. I also hope that they have shown that the shapes of water monuments can communicate meanings, religious meanings, purity, of rebirth, or whatever, and that all types of water architecture underwent considerable change and development. You know, we all know classifications of temple architecture, developments of halls, of roofs, of shikaras, but we find the same levels of elaboration in the water architecture. And these examples are common to every context and every part of South Asia. Now, it's interesting that despite the introduction of faucets, pumps, and pipes under British rule during the 19th century, so new types of water provision coming in, which were practical, but not traditional. You know, it's interesting that still water continued to play an important role in Indian colonial architecture, both under the British building, but as I'll show you also under local building activities. Here are two examples to make my point. The gardens in front and also behind the Rashtrapati Bhavan in Delhi have European influences, of course, Egyptian examples even here, but the gardens behind the Rashtrapati Bhavan are really Mughal gardens. They're modernized, Europeanized, but Mughal water gardens. Or the Victoria Memorial Hall, designed by Sir William Emerson and others between 1902 and 1921, is surrounded by water basins. And one can argue, okay, there's water architecture in Europe, of course, but I'll show you more examples, and maybe this is something we can discuss later. I find the local influences very strong, and it makes such sense in a hot climate like India. We all know how different the climate is next to a larger water basin, a lake, how the wind picks up humidity and how the winds are cooled, and how comfortable this is. So whilst the two examples I'm showing you here were definitely designed for a colonial audience, also Maharajas and kings and local merchants had palaces and mansions constructed, also in Western styles, but combined with the water element. This is here the Singha Durbar in Nepal, in Kathmandu, built by Jang Bahadur Rana in 1901. And of course, he visited Versailles and is influenced by that as well. But we have such a tradition of the combination of palace buildings with water in South Asia that it had to be kind of like this. Now, the integration of water structures into architectural designs is also typical of modern and also of contemporary, but I've only got modern examples here, modern South Asian architecture, which frequently makes direct reference to traditional building types and themes. On the left, Le Corbusier, of course, is no South Asian architect, but he designed the legal assembly next to two water basins in between 1951 and 64. Of course, on the instruction by Nehru to create an architecture which was meant to be unfettered, as he said, by the past. If that's possible, I don't know. I mean, he tried to be European, to be brutalist, to be modernist, but you know, he couldn't avoid to add these water basins, which create a distance to the government buildings. They're protected, they're not reachable. You look at them in awe. You have got the mirror images, the facades are lit by the light which is reflected. You know, it's so, they're very powerful themes. Or the Baha'i temple in Delhi from 1986, constructed by an Iranian architect, but I think with very interesting connections to local architecture, the white marble, the lotus shape, and the 4 tanks surrounding the temple make, I think, a lot of reference. Of course, it's also reminiscent of the Sydney Opera Hall. Buildings do not necessarily only refer to one model, and it's also sometimes, there are different possibilities or connections. I mean, we are all interconnected. I mean, particularly interesting, I think, are examples by Charles Correa, Raj Reval, Balkrishna Doshi, Jeffrey Bava, and you as architecture students or architects will of course be aware of many contemporary, much more recent developments also. It is just part of South Asian culture. And to conclude, finally, I would argue that this shows that the tradition of water architecture in South Asia continues in an unbroken line to the present day, and looks back to previous examples and combines it with new techniques and building materials and approaches, and is a very living, continuous tradition, which I'm looking forward to learning more about in the next couple of years. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Thank you, Julia.
So it's easier to discuss.
This was wonderful. This was, I think, truly an amazing lecture. And while you were presenting, I was actually taking a lot of notes. And I think you have done a great service to the academia by kind of laying out not only information, but also very nice frameworks. So, and we will be taking in questions, Julia, a few questions, because it's slightly late, but we'll still take a few questions. And if you have any question, you can WhatsApp to Shalini or Pragya, and they will read out those questions. And if there are any questions by people, the faculty members present in the Zoom room, you can switch on the mic and ask questions. Before anyone else asks a question, I just wanted to make a comment. And I'm just trying to, I'm still trying to recover from so many things you have said. And apart from the fact that you identify many typologies, and while you identify typologies, I think we have also given a lot of clues as to what is your take or what is the kind of frameworks that you're offering. I was particularly really fascinated by the 2 themes that you have. One was about from platforms to island, and the second about the whole idea of basins of almost like a dollhouse, where you create different hierarchies, different ideas of purity. And I think it kind of is opening up a lot of possibilities for even us as designers to look at how to look at water in a much more sophisticated fashion. It's not a question, but a comment. I think these frameworks can be very useful, even for us who work on contemporary architecture, that there need not be only one way of looking at water elements. And the second thing that really struck me is a kind of a note that you're talking about, that one need not look at the questions of water architecture from the lens of religion alone. But I guess the larger argument that you're saying is that the South Asian region itself presents a unique cultural milieu, if you may, that has led to this kind of, these kind of innovations.
Yes, absolutely.
And what do you think is unique about South Asia, if I may ask you in a very blunt fashion, because a lot of young minds always ask us, is it special, or is it special? What do you think would be 1 or 2 things that are unique that makes it special?
I mean, you definitely have unique types, forms of architecture, which, as far as I know, I mean, I've often searched, for instance, there is a related tradition, for instance, of kinds of tanks combined with stepwell elements in the Jewish tradition in North Africa. But it's very punctual. But it's just one little, punctual is the wrong word, very small area, you know, and one religion only. Nobody else does it outside the region. They're called mikvahs. And so there are sometimes odd connections. But I would argue that the way of structuring rivers with the Ghats, with the platforms, with cremations, with access to boats, with washing, with watering animals is so diverse, with rituals connected to kings and to gods. This is something which I have not found in any other culture, and not even, I have to say, I'm not a specialist of Southeast Asia, but I mean, it's such a related culture. There are certain links, but in my view, in my limited knowledge of architecture outside the area, I would argue that it's unique, and that also definitely the form of building these deep kundas, these a combination of a well with a reservoir, is something which one would have to search maybe for again in desert cultures where water is very precious, where groundwater is very important. But my impression is that, for instance, in North Africa, we have other forms of making water accessible in the underground tunnel systems or whatever, which we partly find also in the Deccan region. But that the particular form of kundas is, I would argue, unique to South Asia. And it's very typical of South Asian culture, I think, to have this enormous, boundless creativity of combining, of creating further. I mean, there is not one kunda where the pyramidal steps are exactly the same. I mean, there are, you think, you know, after having seen 10, 20, 25 forms of pyramidal steps that there can't be any more. And there is, you know, every one is different. And that is also something which I find breathtaking when studying South Asian architecture, this enormous creativity and this challenge an architect seems to see to never do the same twice again, you know, always to go beyond the, you know, to build things which collapse, but to try out where the limits are and to try to go beyond them. And, you know, I've shown these types, but they're hybrids all the time. And the architects seem to be aware of the types and to play, you know, and to really try to combine and not to be boxed, you know. Of course, as an art historian, I want to box and understand and be clear. But of course, for an architecture with his or her creativity, you know, it's exactly the opposite. And that I find, I mean, of course, also every cathedral in Europe is different, but I find this enormous diversity and development and playfulness, I find really typical and really impressive of South Asian. I mean, an enormous engineering skill combined with visions, with images, with meanings, you know, never just staying on the surface. Those are maybe some of the elements why
I think you're making a very valid point about creativity within what we perceive to be traditional and something that follows very strong rules. Well, there are rules. You say they are aware of the typology, but they also break those rules. That's a very interesting thing to kind of think about. I would request my colleagues if they would, it's a wonderful opportunity. Professor Nile, would you like to ask something?
Yes.
Thank you. To hear your perspective.
Thank you so much, Julia. It was very interesting and it brought out a completely different perspective. I mean, we live here, but sometimes you have to see things from a different perspective to appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah. While you were presenting, I was just thinking, in fact, I wanted to ask you this question as a layman, but water architecture, isn't there water architecture based solutions, I mean environments in, let's say, in Venice, for example, or even many of these European places, the bridges are very unique across rivers, you know, like the same river and so on. So even in Japan, I've seen photographs also of very unique structures with water surrounding them. So would you comment on that? I mean, if...
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, water architecture is, I think, a fascinating topic all around the world, because we need it, of course, for transport, for communication, for irrigation, and it always has religious connotations. A place like Venice, of course, where all the streets in inverted commas are channels, are water. Of course, here water plays an enormous role. Fascinating, beautiful, but I don't think it has the depths of diversity which we find, of diverse uses which we find in India, because I find, or let's talk about, let's say, in Germany, of course, in Christian ritual, also water and purification plays an important role, baptism or entering a Catholic church and having sacred water. But it's I find it's very much detached. It's very sanctified, kind of within a ritual context. But when we go to the Rhine River, we don't necessarily think about it as something religious. You know, there's stories about Father Rhine or mythological stories, but people will not let candles float on the river, or they will not bathe in it, or we don't create our dead. It has become very sanitized. Religion and life have become much more apart, separated from one another. And I would say the same in Venice. I'm sure that canals are used in the carnival for boats with festival and for transport. But as far as I know, there are no Catholic rituals, bathing rituals, or you know, it's more practical. And I think this is why art historians at least those coming from the West, have often disregarded water architecture, because they have just considered it as engineering, as practical bridges, as technical constructions. And they have not seen or appreciated the social and the religious dimensions, which are so strongly interwoven in an Asian context. So the canals are interesting, but we don't have such wonderful steps and platform as we find along every kind of Indian river, even in small places, at Bittur, in Uttar Pradesh or whatever. So architecturally, I think the Ghats, also having to adapt to these enormously fluctuating levels, are much more advanced, I have to say.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Are there any questions from faculty members in the room?
May I?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Julia.
Hi,
first of all, I would like to thank you for a wonderful lecture. And it has presented with a different kind of a structure through which we can look at water architecture. And in fact, it also raises a lot of questions how we try to integrate water in modern architecture or contemporary architecture, because this is considered to be, one of the failures of, I can say, I mean, water, we have not, as a modern society, we have not been able to integrate water with the architecture. And this framework gives some hints towards which we can, start thinking about it. So I'm very thankful for that.
Thank you.
One question, there are a lot of questions in my mind, but I would just like to ask one question here. When you saw across these various water structures, I saw some which also had built structures. And the question which comes in my mind is, do you see any difference in the ownership of these edges, like public ownership or private ownership, and has that resulted in a different attitude towards this water edge as well?
a difference whether it's public or private. I mean, I would definitely say that the facades along the rivers or tanks are really important, and there is an enormous connection and interaction. And I find that very often, as I showed once with that tower or minaret-like tower in the Sikodwara, that we very often try to counterbalance the flatness, horizontality of the water with vertical elements. So along the Ganges, for instance, in the facades, we find very strong bastion tower elements which also structure the facades. And whilst, for instance, in Benares, there might even be a practical reason because the river can flood and a defensive building style is conducive, is good. For instance, Pushkar Lake never rises very tall because it collects rainwater and has a little funnel inlet. Here we have no floods I'm aware of, at least. And here also the facade is structured with these bastion, very long bastion tower pillar decorations. But I find that both, I mean, we find, I mean, it's a kind of defensive architecture which seems to support tower-like vertical elements to counterbalance, I think. But that we would find both in a private building or in a Ramsala or in a temple or in a palace along the river. Of course, a palace will do this on a larger scale in a more monumental way, but even a private house very often will have decorative features, opening up windows, bay windows, balconies over the river, access. The steps often fan out very interestingly, kind of to stress the entrance, or a little an alleyway will fan out into a kind of a pyramidal step formation, making it very clear that here the alley ends and the sacred area of the Ghat where you take off your shoes starts. But it's very interesting that even when there are no buildings along, for instance, a Ghat along a river, often we have at least a facade, a screen, something to end, to demarcate, to show. I mean, another theme which is so important would have been gateways to water, because we also very often find very pronounced access points to mark the thresholds. So the facades are incredibly important. It's very interesting to think about building along water, how one can create kind of interactions and connections visually and physically. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. There's a question from one of the students, if I can ask. So this person is asking, Professor Julia, that does this water architecture of South Asia influence other countries' architecture or other regions? Or is it something you find to be very limited to South Asia? That's an interesting question. I was wondering, yeah.
I mean, I am aware, I mean, there definitely is a long, I mean, Buddhist texts are more critical of purification by water, but I would argue it's simply to differentiate themselves from Hindus, to show that they are different. So one is not, as a Buddhist, one is not meant to sprinkle one's ashes into the Ganges, but Buddhists sprinkle their ashes into water. So, you know, the Ganges close connection is tried to be kept out. So there is Buddhist water architecture. And of course, with the spread of Buddhism, also water architecture to a certain extent moved. Buddhism originates in India and it moves from there. So in Southeast Asia, I am aware in Myanmar, in Burma, in Laos, in Thailand, there are some structures which are related to South Indian Buddhist or also slightly to Nepalese Buddhist types of, they are kind of what I would call a kunda. They go deep into the ground, but they often don't tap groundwater vertically, but sideways. So we have a structure you step into, and then you have spouts coming out of the wall, which cut into shallow aquifers, which, you know, subterranean water levels, which you tap sideways. So that I have also seen in Southeast Asia. So I would argue that this Kunda-like, Dara-like Nepalese type of Buddhist architecture coming from India into Nepal spread eastwards. Otherwise, it's, I mean, of course, Indian architecture, for instance, had an enormous influence on British architecture, on a decorative level, on, I mean, of course, initially they also mix up Indian and Chinese and sometimes Islamic elements. It's not so clearly delineated, but because I think Britain is such a wet and a damn cold country, if I put it negatively. I've lived there for many years and I love it, but they have a lot of rain and I think water is not so precious. So there are local reasons for maybe not picking water architecture in particular as a reference point, but picking arches and decorations or images, sacred, the elephant or the obelisk or such references more likely, but I'm trying to, I mean, of course it spread into the Himalayas and it went to Sri Lanka and via Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia. So there is definitely a certain diffusion. Also early on, I mean, we have the first fascinating water architectural structures in the Indus civilization, you know, with the great baths and the wells, and they might well also have influenced Mesopotamian water structures. But when we go back so far, it's sometimes difficult to really prove who was the first, you know, who discovered cities, you know, this is something we often discuss, you know, was it one community or was it discovered everywhere? You know, it gets difficult to prove these things.
You can imagine the situation often.
Yes, yes.
So there are many questions coming in, we can't take many, but I would like my colleague who has requested, Manali.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question, then I have one last question from one of the students.
Hello, ma'am. Manali here. Very nice presentation. And recently, I just want to add to what you were talking about, different categorization of this water structure. Recently, I visited this place called Viramgam, closer to Ahmedabad. It has very interesting purification system. So it has a bigger talab and there is a purification system and there is a bigger lake and there are lots of shrines around that lake.
Seen it. It's wonderful.
Like to understand that for every kind of water structures, there are these different purification systems. So have you discovered any unique kind of purification system for these lakes or for these kind of water structures? Because even we visited this Sarkhes Rosa, it also has a different, kind of system where they work as a catchment area and all. So I would like to know that, have you discovered any different such purification system around the places which you have visited?
Do you mean the purification, how the water in the lakes is cleansed? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, there are different techniques, sluices and filters. And sometimes there are areas where the water is meant to settle, the mud is settling, where we have sort of stepped systems. I have found this largely in Gujarat and a little bit in the Deccan region around Golconda, where this is also quite developed. Because of yes?
Yeah, even in Gujarat, what I have observed is that there are bigger lakes and within some distance, there are some wells also. Which act as a purification system. So the water is taken to the wells and people from the villages uses those wells, then the lakes. So that also we are observing recently, that there are lots of small step wells, which, you know, takes this water and people of the villages uses them. So,
I mean, well water definitely is the most reliable water source, wells, and also the purest, because the water has run through different filtering systems in the ground. So that is the most desirable. Water structures, of course, are also regularly cleansed. And very interestingly, there's often a particular day in the season or a particular group of people responsible for it, but often it's done communally. We've all seen photographs of the Amritsar tank being cleansed as part of a ritual behavior of giving. So it has been an issue which has, I think, occupied architects again and again, because of course to drain a whole structure and to cleanse it is an enormous amount of work. So I mean, often I mean, for instance, in some of the kundas, which have some have a well in the middle, but also on the side, and then the side well is used for drinking and cooking water, and then the well in the middle or the kunda is used for bathing. So often it's actual physical purity, but then sometimes it's overridden. You know, of course, the Ganges, whatever factory is built next to it, will ever always be considered pure and you know, ritually pure. So there is sort of different levels of purity we are talking about, but I think particularly for architecture students or groups, I mean, to study more how traditionally the water structures are kept clean. I mean, today we are maybe employing pumps or whatever, but it's always wonderful to go back to the traditional techniques, which are often much cheaper and easier to implement. One is not dependent on electricity or on spare parts from the West or whatever, or from Japan. It's very, very interesting to go back to the roots and to I mean, also it's used in air conditioning, you know, to wonderful. I mean, for architects,
the self-cleansing thing.
Yes, to see, you know, to use to build in mud and to cool with water, and you know, have no air conditioning, no dependency on electricity. Even today, particularly today, with you know, our new thinking and awareness of nature, it's wonderful to learn from the past, and I think we can learn so much from Indian builders here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was very well said. Thanks, Manali. Now we'll take one last quick question, and then we'll have to end the session. It's slightly late in the day. There are many questions, but one student has asked a very interesting question. What makes you, Professor Julia, so curious to study water architecture, and where did you start?
Where did I start? Actually quite difficult to remember. I mean, I mean, I think the diversity, the adaptability, the creativity, the religious and practical connectivity, it's just really fascinating. Not to put anything else down, but when you study a temple, it is basically religious. It of course functions, but to have a water structure which provides access to water and drinking water even in the dry season, and it's still also religious. I mean, it's incredible. It's like a whole, having the whole world and all its aspects in one structure. So the and the beauty. I mean, the mirror images, the light, the shade, the coolness. I mean, it's just fascinating. It's a real treat to visit water sites in South Asia. It's a real reward. And I guess whilst I was studying at SOAS, I traveled in Asia. I visited well-known sites, of course, in the beginning, the highlights of art historical research, and I very often discovered water structures which to me appeared as important, as wonderful, and I could often find very little written about it. And you know, there was an enormous emphasis when I started on the stepwells in Gujarat, which undoubtedly are wonderful, but of course they are not the only water architecture there is. And the early books seem to argue that they were unique to Gujarat, and I could see that they were also found in West Bengal and in Karnataka. So I think I found it aroused my curiosity to understand it better and to bring more attention to it also. And I think I think that, yeah, I've really enjoyed that. And I've often heard from people in the audience that they want to go back to Nepal or to Gujarat and pay more attention to this, because they followed their guidebooks, which very rarely mention water architecture, and to discover a subterranean level. One, you know, when you sit in your taxi and you drive through a town, you don't really see it. You have to get out of your car and go down into these wells, and you're absolutely rewarded. And so maybe to encourage us to penetrate into areas which have been neglected. And we are very fortunate that there are such areas, you know. I don't even mean it negatively, you know, there's still so much to discover. And I encourage all students listening to, you know, to find their own niche and to discover whatever it is, and to contribute to this vast field of South Asian architecture, where so much still needs to be worked on and discovered and shown to the public. And I really look forward to reading all those future works, which hopefully are in the making.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julia. Thank you. This was wonderful. This was a treat, an intellectual treat. You have opened so many different topics for all of us. And I think your lecture today is going to definitely inspire scholars. They're going to help scholars in structuring their thought, but also inspire a lot of students to pick up this topic and to work more. And as you very rightly say, there is so much still to be done. Mm-hmm. And we need not be just focused on one or two areas, but we can look across all of India to find such examples. So on behalf of Navrachna University and my students and the faculty and everyone here, I wish to really give you a big thank you. Thanks a lot, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you for having invited me, for having given me the opportunity to speak to you, and also so long. I hope it wasn't too long. And thank you for the discussions and for opening my eyes and drawing my attention also to new areas to be explored. And I hope we'll do some of it together in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, we are looking forward. And as Professor Julia said, that she's, and I should have mentioned that before, she's part of our advisory board for the Center for Heritage Research. We have a lot of plans together. Hope to see you here with your students, Julia, very soon.
Thank you, Pratyush. And
thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Have a
Pragya,
nice
have you taken a group photo, Pragya?
No. I don't know. Maybe
Pragya or Dinesh, somebody, let's take a group photo if you've not taken it.
We have taken one.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Nilay. Thank you, Pratyush, for inviting. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, and have a lovely evening in India.
Thank you.
And stay safe. Bye-bye.